Hey folks, Nathan P. Butler here, and this is my Star Wars vlog, the voice of reason or lack thereof. I don't tend to use it very often. I'd like to use it a bit more. Don't get a chance to record a whole lot, so most of that time is spent focusing on either the board game stuff I'm trying to do or focusing on from the Star Wars Home Video Library and such. But I felt as though it was a good time to bring this back and hopefully adhere to that whole voice of reason aspect here that I try to lean towards all the time with intellectual honesty and such. Less going off the rails with the or lack thereof part. But I thought it was an appropriate time to do a video looking at the current state of Star Wars. Kind of where things stand in my personal opinion. Cannot stress enough, it's a vlog. My personal opinion, yours may differ, and that is okay. We should not be attacking each other for opinions that differ, as we will see. But to get a look at the state of Star Wars, because at this point, I'm recording this on April 27th of 2024, and that means we are coming very close to May the 4th. May the 4th be with you, Star Wars Day, as it is called. Although, honestly, I think Star Wars Day really should be May 25th, because it's the anniversary of A New Hope hitting theaters before it got its subtitle and all, but that's okay. May the 4th is what is stuck, so May the 4th is Star Wars Day. But while that is coming in about a week or so, we actually just passed 2 days ago a key anniversary in the evolution of Star Wars, and particularly in the advent of sort of a splitting point in the eras of Star Wars, which is that on April 25th, 2014, 10 years ago, just a couple of days ago, we had the announcement that the Star Wars continuity that had been going since 1991 and retroactively included stuff all the way back to 1976 was essentially being set aside, in essence, in favor of essentially a reboot, the launch of a new canon driven by the story group that is now the current canonical version, the current ongoing, growing, official version of Star Wars. That the old continuity will be rebranded as Legends and continue from there. Now, years ago, I did a vlog about how basically a reboot was kind of inevitable and the better option of what the options could have been for what was going to happen. Lucas had sold Lucasfilm to Disney. And when he did that, you knew that if somebody's buying Star Wars, regardless of whether it's Disney or anybody else, they're going to want to make money off of the primary focus of the franchise and the primary attention getter of the franchise, the primary moneymaker of the franchise, which would be, aside from merchandising, movies. They were going to make new movies. And if they're buying it now, while Harrison Ford, Carrie Fisher at the time, and Mark Hamill were still alive, they were going to try to make new films, probably utilizing those legacy characters, which meant, more than likely, telling stories in a time period already covered by the official continuity at the time. Again, the official continuity as defined at the time, prior to the reboot, was all these books by Bantam and then Del Rey and so forth. All these comics by Dark Horse Comics, and eventually retroactively to the early Marvel stuff back in the day, or the newspaper strips even from back in the day. Various video games by companies like LucasArts and so forth. It was the original 6 Lucas films. It was the Clone Wars micro-series by Genndy Tartakovsky. It was droids. It was Ewoks. It was the Ewok telemovies. It was the Clone Wars up through its first 5 seasons. That was the official continuity of the time, kicking off with Timothy Zahn's Heir to the Empire in 1991, kicking off in comic form with Dark Empire and so forth. I got into it myself back in 1992, starting with Dark Force Rising, picked up the paperback of Heir to the Empire at the same time, jumped into Dark Empire, I want to say around issue, I think it was 5, the one with Clone Emperor on the cover, and then picked up the rest of those and continued on from there, and I was certainly hooked. I've been a Star Wars fan since I was little, but to actually get into the books and stuff, I hadn't gotten into many of the comics. I got a few of the old Marvel comics. Hadn't really delved too much into the RPG or anything at the time, given, just what my interest and my age was at the time. But boy, give me the movies, give me the toys, and oh my gosh, now there's books. And running with that for years. That led me to eventually, in 1997, launch the Star Wars Timeline Gold, which is still the single most comprehensive Star Wars chronology document available anywhere, with 3 documents focused entirely on the Legends continuity, or the old official continuity. 1 focused on the story group's newer canon, and then kind of an appendices file with just various, stuff in it. I eventually retired from that in 2018. I did Star Wars podcasting, mostly focused on the Legends continuity, because that was the continuity at the time, from 2002 with Chrono Radio, through stuff like the EU Review and whatnot, all the way up through when I retired while being a host on Star Wars Beyond the Films, talking about Legends and canon stuff, and Cloud City Casino, talking about the various video games and tabletop games and so forth. So, spent a lot of my time seeped in that continuity, and over time, that continuity evolved. Just giving you some background here for those who are unaware or need a refresher. That continuity evolved into sort of a structural canon. Canon was used in a very loose phrase constantly within that era prior to there being an actual structure. You had canon, quasi-canon. There's Lucas's canon, there's the other. You had all these different phrases for it, with the key distinction initially just being that there's Lucas's vision as seen in his films, and there's everything else subordinate to it, which was like the licensed works of the books, the comics, and so on that Lucasfilm was able to license to different companies thanks to the thumbs up from Lucas, but that none of that was ever going to be canon on par with the films. It was always effectively subordinate. Eventually, with Leland Chee and the Holocron Continuity Database, we finally got a detailed structure for how that would work. You would have G-canon at the top. G-canon being anything that was George's definitive vision, typically coming from his films. You initially did not have a T-canon, I'll come back to it. You had a C-canon, continuity canon. That was stuff meant to fit together. This unprecedented push since 1991 to link things into one giant universe that most franchises didn't do. That was the books, the comics. Comics like mine, like Star Wars Tales 21's Equals and Opposites, that, you know, got released with the comic pack and so forth, that I have up on my shelves, which actually, oddly enough, has its 20th anniversary this year. I should do a retrospective or something about that. Well, from my time doing that, or assisting with the Essential Atlas and whatnot. But just this massive continuity of stuff meant to fit together. Then it was S-canon, secondary canon. Sources that were of questionable validity. Maybe it would count, maybe it wouldn't. Kind of depends on how it'd be used elsewhere. And then you had N-canon, which was the non-canon stuff, because the expanded universe label was applied by Lucasfilm to everything being produced outside the films, but not all of that was necessarily in continuity. You had stuff out there just like little one-off parodies. You had stuff like the Star Wars Infinity stories, which are great little what-if stories. They weren't part of that continuity, so there was sort of a category for it called in canon. Notice the word canon being used even though it was not canonical in terms of what fit within that continuity. That's why they would usually use the phrase official continuity, not canon, because it was kind of a messy term again. It had been misused and used a lot of different ways. Eventually you get a T-canon slid in between G and C. The T-canon was the stuff that was Lucas-driven to an extent, but also by others, which came from the Clone Wars. It was television canon. At the time, only counted the Clone Wars because of the heavy influence of Lucas, but also others like Dave Filoni. Right? So G, T, C, S, N. With the official continuity essentially being G, T, and C, with a little bit of S where it would fit, but no N. And that T-canon part was a tricky beast to deal with, because when we got to Attack of the Clones, in the years between it and Revenge of the Sith, both in terms of chronology and in terms of the real world, 2002 to 2005, or 22 to 19 BBY, there was a stretch there where Lucas allowed the licensees and Lucasfilm and so forth, LucasArts and all, to produce games and comics and novels and stuff to fill that gap. And it was pretty dark, interesting, interconnected, well-woven stuff with stories at distinct, often weak markers in relation to each other. And then came the Clone Wars cartoon, Lucas-driven with Filoni. And the idea was, we're just going to drop that into the continuity, and we'll figure out how it's supposed to fit later. Granted, it made no sense. In the comics, Anakin never had an apprentice of Ahsoka Tano. The way things turn out for Ventress is vastly different. The timing of when Anakin got knighted is vastly different. But the idea was, don't worry, it's going to contradict. It drops in like a wrecking ball, as I've said plenty of times. It shatters it. But don't worry, eventually we'll get an answer of how it's really meant to all fit together. But the answer never came. Because by then, by the time Clone Wars was ending, the reboot was slated. So we have this massive continuity with some contradictions, but mostly fairly coherent for its size. And then one little era of 3 years that's an absolute mess with two completely, or almost completely contradictory versions of that period kind of slammed together shattering each other into pieces and no one really willing to tell how the pieces fit together. And that was kind of where things were left, because then came the reboot, no answer, Clone Wars gets canceled on Cartoon Network, and then the last episodes that were in production at the time would get put together for the Lost Missions, kind of a shorter season 6 through in the US Netflix. But nothing supposedly going to be beyond that. You did have some unproduced scripts get turned into the Darth Maul Son of Dathomir comic series, but otherwise kind of a stop there. Really the only thing left trickling out and allowing to be continued for the Legends continuity, or the old official continuity, or whatever you want to call it, was Star Wars The Old Republic, the MMO, which continued on for quite a while, actually, afterwards, giving at least a little bit of new material for that continuity. But instead, what they did was create this new continuity by basically going in and sort of copying and pasting the G level and T levels of canon, the live action films and Clone Wars, plopping it into a new continuity, a new document, so to speak, and then growing it from there, and focusing essentially entirely on that, minus like some Lego stuff and whatnot, and leaving only the Old Republic to continue on with the other continuity that had been going since 1991. And that was kind of a shocking moment when that announcement came 10 years ago. And I did a video way back early in this series that really, they didn't have a lot of choices in this, and I think the way that it worked out, at least in terms of leaving Legends intact, is probably the best of the three options that presented itself. One option would have been that they just come in and say, okay, we're going to keep the continuity the way that it is. Which sounds great until you realize they also want to make these new movies, and they want to make use of probably these actors who are still alive. Which means probably a Clone Wars treatment. Let's make some new stories. Who gives a crap if they fit? Drop them in. See canon and everything else has to make way for it, and if it shatters the continuity, screw it, it just shatters the continuity. That would have been bad. Every time they create something new like that, you would have shattered another piece of it until Legends was all the shattered mess in many important areas that we got with the Clone Wars, with those contradictory stories and never getting an answer of how it's supposed to fit. Overwriting tales. They would not probably have done anything that actually was designed to fit within that continuity, because that would require a lot of homework on behalf of the people who are trying to watch it, trying to understand it, and there weren't a lot of nooks and crannies left open with the original characters that didn't have something going on with them explored, because it was such a rich history going all the way from Jedi onward through the Fate of the Jedi era and so forth, eventually with a gap heading towards Legacy, which where my son takes his name from. Yes, I'm a horrible fan. I know, I'm a horrible fan because I'm willing to like multiple continuities of Star Wars, and that makes me a traitor to Legends, apparently, because people like that come out of the woodwork on this particular anniversary, and yet my son, born after the reboot, is named after Cade Skywalker. Whatever. But the point being that was an approach would have been messy. Doing it by making it fit wasn't going to happen. They were going to expand it. So what do? Well, one clean thing you could do that leaves Legends intact is just do a reboot so they are separate timelines, separate continuities, very much like, say, Infinity's was for Infinity's Return of the Jedi, and Infinity's The Empire Strikes Back, Infinity A New Hope, and Legends. 4 separate timelines. Split it out. Don't do anything to mess with Legends anymore. Don't pull a Clone Wars on it. But, in their case, ignore it. The ignoring thing, I think, was the big issue. It was the right thing to do the separation, because otherwise you're shattering the crap out of the existing continuity. At least let it live as it is. But to not ever really, aside from Old Republic, bother, or I guess one Marvel comic, not to ever try to expand upon the Legends continuity anymore beyond that, that I think was somewhat of a mistake. I think they assumed that readers and viewers were too dumb to distinguish between them and didn't want to dilute the brand and cause confusion. Whereas there are plenty of franchises in science fiction and such that do separate continuities, and it's fine. Whether it's Transformers or Star Trek with the Kelvin timeline, sci-fi viewers tend to be smart, and people who are interested in minutia, we would have understood it. but they still haven't. There's Legends collection stuff. Heck, my comic from Star Wars Tales in 2004 is about to get a reprint, I believe, in a collection for the New Republic, like Epic collection or whatever it is in, I think it's October. I think it's my birth month, which would be kind of cool. But for the most part, they just haven't touched. And I think that has been a bit of a mistake. But that means that now what we have is a whole new continuity that's only been going for basically 10 years. And the question is sort of, where do things stand now? And I'm not going to do this as a direct comparison between the different continuities, though that will come up often as a point of reference. I think there's 3 really interesting ways you could do a video like that, and maybe someday I will. You could do something that just compares where Legends was when it ended, right, whenever anything but Old Republic kept going, where the reboot happened, to where story group canon is now. Be interesting enough. Or you can make a comparison of where the previous continuity was after 10 years in 2001 versus where this one is after 10 years. Might be interesting as well. Or perhaps even something comparing where the current continuity in the state of Star Wars is now versus where it might have been had there been no reboot, which also probably means no sale of the company at all still under Lucas's control, going forward 10 years beyond that, if the Legends continuity continued to grow with things like Sword of the Jedi and whatnot, which was proposed and eventually canceled at the time. Those would be very interesting points of comparison. That ain't what this is. Okay? This is designed as just sort of my thoughts with a whole lot of preamble, apparently, on the state of Star Wars as of this moment. I almost didn't make the video, again, because I didn't know if I would have enough thoughts to put out here. I thought it would be kind of rambling, which it is. I wasn't sure if I'd have enough detail to talk about, because I'm actually behind a little bit on my Star Wars comic and novel reading, because I spent months reading The Wheel of Time and have just never gotten caught entirely back up again. But also, this is the time of year when the douchebags come out of the woodwork. The people that at one point I referred to as alt legends, the purists. The people who believe that if you enjoy anything Star Wars other than what they enjoy primarily, which in that case is the Legends continuity, that previous continuity, if you can enjoy anything beyond that, you are a traitor. If you acknowledge with intellectual honesty that whoever owns the rights to something gets to decide what at that time is considered the official version of that story, in this case, that Disney decrees that the story group's current canon is indeed the current official version of Star Wars, not Legends, that you are a traitor of some kind. It is ridiculous. But this same shit happens at the anniversary year after year. It just comes out more out of the woodwork on a major anniversary, like this one being 10 years. We have had people get hidden from the channel and basically ignored in the last couple of weeks, with people popping up declaring me a traitor for daring to enjoy Star Wars in general. I wonder if they would have felt the same way if I talked about how much I enjoyed, back in the day when it was published, Infinity's A New Hope. It's a whole different continuity. Or the Lego stuff. My God, it's a different continuity. I wonder if I would have been branded a traitor. I wonder if the people over at Wikipedia are all branded traitors because they have entries for different things with tabs for canon and Legends. Oh my God, they make the distinction. And yes, they also acknowledge what Disney currently, as the rights holder, has decreed to be the current official version, which is also the version that is currently expanding the most. But I decided, you know what? Even though a video like this that will often make favorable comparisons where the favor goes towards the Legends era, not the current era, and that might make them say, haha, see, we were right. Even though they were calling me a traitor, which means they weren't right. They were wrong on that, but see, he agrees with us. You know, that whole fair weather fan thing where you either love or hate someone, whether you agree with them on a particular point or not. Even though that would be the case, I feel like, you know what? It's worth doing for those who are intellectually honest enough to view a video like this as it is intended. It might be an interesting point for discussion for those who can be civil with it. And while it may prove the traitor comments wrong, and at the same time make them think, aha, he must agree with us, let me say this up front, and it gives me a chance to make it clear. No, I don't agree. If you're a purist of any kind, you're a gatekeeper. If you're someone who only likes one thing and only accepts other fans if they like the exact same thing you like, that's not right. Not at all. Fandom is a varied group of people with different interests, with different preferences. Like what you like. It doesn't make you a traitor to like something different than what someone else likes. I don't particularly care for the Lego stuff very much, but that doesn't make me a traitor to those who like the Lego stuff. Enjoy what you're going to enjoy. It is a hobby, and if a hobby is making you so upset that you want to make death threats or otherwise start going off on tirades to the point where you are trying to tear other people down about it, you're doing the hobby wrong because it's supposed to be fun. It's not supposed to be that level of stress. In any event, let's dive in after this giant preamble here. What I want to look at is the state of Star Wars, in my opinion, in several different categories. In terms of films, in terms of television, in terms of books, in terms of comics, in terms of tabletop games, in terms of video games, and in terms of theme parks. And to some small extent, in terms of fandom. All of which are things at least within my sphere of knowledge. The home video stuff is kind of a mixed bag because it's always just about putting out stuff relating to the other product. So I might touch on it, but I'm not sure that is something where it's really about the state of Star Wars so much as the state of the home video industry, which I cover plenty on from the Star Wars Home Video Library. So starting out here, what do I think of the state of Star Wars currently in terms of films? On the one hand, I think the Disney era has been fantastic for Star Wars films because we've just got any, right? At the time that Lucas wrapped up Revenge of the Sith, he was flat out saying he only ever intended for there to be 6. So we went from saying there was 1, and then it was 12 with A New Hope being the first one, and then there was going to be 9 with A New Hope being 4, and there's only ever going to be 6. And then came the Disney buyout, and it was, I never said anyone else couldn't create more, just that I wasn't going to. And then here came the 7th live-action film with The Force Awakens, and of course we got Rogue One, Last Jedi, Solo, Rise of Skywalker. I think the fact that we have new Star Wars films at all is just fantastic. And we've got some pretty solid films, depending on which ones we're looking at, depending on your opinion or preferences. We've got some weak ones, we've got some strong ones. I did a ranking video of the Star Wars films in my personal order of preference. You can check that out as a separate video here a while back. But personally, I love Rogue One. I think it is fantastic. And the more I watch it, the more I find Solo to be just a really fun but very safe, non-controversial romp within Star Wars. I think the sequel trilogy has its issues. It has some great moments. It has some issues. I would love to see more fleshing out to try to retcon and explain away some of those issues within some of the other stories that are out there. But in general, I enjoyed them, but they wouldn't top, say, the original trilogy, for example, for me. But there's some pretty solid moments within them, and I like where some of the character development could go, depending on where they go with it in the future. But a mixed bag just in the sense that what we got has been more of a mixed bag, I think, than, say, like the original trilogy era, where it was just kind of banger after banger. But you still had people at the time complaining about The Empire Strikes Back, complaining about Return of the Jedi, for example. With the prequels, same kind of thing. But I think a lot of that comes down to the expectations of the audience and their generation. Like, there are going to be kids who grow up with the Disney era live action films as their favorites because it was the first that they saw. Just like there are people who are sort of the Clone Wars era fans, or the prequel era fans, or the original trilogy era fans. Not the era that they prefer, but the era they grew up with that sort of solidified their love for Star Wars and what made them get into this in the first place, for which those will have a special nostalgic feel in their hearts and whatnot. So I think film-wise, I mean, obviously we're in a better place just in the sense that we have any. I think that right now, though, weirdly enough, we're in a weird slump where it's actually kind of rough because it seems like constantly we're getting Star Wars films being announced that then never get made. They get canceled before they even get anywhere. I'm curious to see if the current ones that are announced on the slate are actually going to get made. We shall see. So at the moment, the state of Star Wars with films is we don't have any new ones right now. It sucks. Recently in the Disney era, we got some. That's great to have some more. Your mileage will vary. But the fact that at least Star Wars films are on the table as an option is, I think, a good thing. Star Wars television, I think we're in a really, depending on your perspective, we're in a really good place, I think, for Star Wars television. Obviously, in the past, Star Wars television was not in a great place. You had the era of, like, droids, Ewoks, and the Ewok telemovies that were all just kind of, yeah, that Ewok series, especially that second season, good lord. And then you had the Genndy Tartakovsky micro series, very cool, very stylized, but at the same time, very short. But really the only big Star Wars TV series we got prior to the Disney era was the Clone Wars. And it had kind of a rough start to a degree, really got going, and then sort of ended as it was sort of hitting its stride, which is unfortunate. It ended at the time, eventually to come back later on for a great last season and so forth. But now we have, The Mandalorian starting its own kind of craze and everything at this point, with Grogu or Baby Yoda. You have Ahsoka getting a series and kind of tying up some loose ends and whatnot for Rebels. We, of course, had Rebels itself, which was a great series, in my opinion. Probably my favorite Star Wars animated series. Consistently, I think Clone Wars has better individual moments, but consistently, I think Rebels turned out better. Resistance, not a huge fan of Resistance. But now we've got things like Andor, fantastic television, not just Star Wars television, but television, particularly for those interested in history or politics or the rebellion aspect, the Rebels versus Empire aspect, not just the Jedi versus Sith aspect of Star Wars. We have Obi-Wan Kenobi giving us a little bit of a glimpse into that period after. I think the Grand Inquisitor looks a little weird. I'm not as big a fan of Reva, though she has an interesting couple of moments. But boy, the emotional impact of seeing Obi-Wan, the interactions with Leia, the interaction briefly with Luke, the interactions with Vader. There's some great stuff in Star Wars TV right now. But I will say that there is a caveat here that we're going to see as a caveat in a lot of stuff, which is there's a very particular thread you need to enjoy to really get into, I would say, Star Wars television right now. Not so much with Andor, not so much with Obi-Wan, but with Ahsoka, Book of Boba Fett, Mandalorian, and so forth. The Bad Batch, even. You really have to buy into what you might call the Filoniverse to really get into that stuff, I would say. Filoni is to Star Wars on film, or Star Wars television programs, and now movies eventually, to a degree what someone like Timothy Zahn was, not now in writing for Story Group Canon, but especially in the later days writing in the Legends continuity, which was to be someone who was sort of a big name, writing stories that were well received, but almost always focusing around the same core characters that they created early on and just constantly building on that without expanding too much beyond that point. Filoni does that with TV, building off of Clone Wars, building off of Rebels as we get things in Mandalorian, Book of Boba Fett, and Ahsoka. So if you like the Filoni stuff, like Ahsoka, the character, you're going to enjoy current Star Wars TV. If you don't like that stuff, if that was never your thing, then you're not probably going to like a lot of current Star Wars television. I am fortunate in that I do enjoy that stuff, so I do enjoy the current stuff. I wasn't as big on Book of Boba Fett because of the lack of really feeling like there was a lot of payoff at the end with it. Just going, all these loose threads, and we're just going to have a big battle and not really tie up stuff, or if we're going to tie it up, it's going to be very loosely tied up. But I've enjoyed that stuff. So to me, having Star Wars on television at all in multiple, numerous forms through these streaming services, Disney Plus primarily, of course Netflix did bring us a 6th season of Clone Wars fairly early on in the Disney era, to be able to have that is great. Because we really didn't have that before, and that Star Wars rumored TV series in the latter days before the Disney buyout was constantly rumored and never ever saw the light of day. What was it, Underworld? Just never saw the light of day. So the fact that we have Star Wars on TV live action at all is fantastic. The fact that the technology now, thanks to ILM, has reached a point where you could do that type of thing and have it work on television, or in this case, Disney Plus television, whatever, and have you be able to create Star Wars level productions, that's fantastic. So I think Star Wars television is in a terrific place at this point. Certainly the best place, I would say, probably than it has been ever. As far as books, I think that we're in I guess we're in an okay place. There have been some really good Star Wars books under the new canon, like, Lost Stars. Lost Stars is still one of my favorite Star Wars books ever. Dark Disciple, although one could argue that if there wasn't a reboot, would not have been a novel, it would have been episodes of the show. We've got, explorations into like the beginnings of the Clone Wars. We've got explorations into the background of Padme and whatnot, finally getting a little bit more fleshed out with some tales with her and the Handmaidens and whatnot. We've got some background leading into the revelations, of course, from Rise of Skywalker. But it really does feel like there's a very different tone. I've said this before. There's a very different tone between the stuff we're seeing in books now with the current canon and what we got with Legends, because in the Legends era, there were not going to be any more films. Leading up to the prequels, there were not going to be any more films, and they announced the prequels, holy crap, and then leading out of the prequels, there weren't going to be any more films. So you had an entire product line, essentially, an entire timeline, where the vast majority of it was built in a time when if there was going to be major impactful events, major character development, it would happen in the pages, not, say, on the screen. And unfortunately, I think what we see now is a lot of the stories that are being told, they're solid enough in and of themselves, but a lot of times they don't feel particularly impactful because all the really big impactful stuff is being held for television or held for film. It feels like right now, Star Wars in publishing is a lot more of like what we would see with most franchises, where it's like a supporting role, so to speak, to the films and TV, than being the vanguard of new and exciting ideas. For the most part, a lot of origin stories or oddball stories and whatnot. Again, not that they're bad stories, but it's a different flavor when you are not allowing them to really be the impactful points in many respects. Or you're using them to flesh out backstory, but some of your backstory still hasn't been fleshed out for the screen, so you're not even really fleshing it out in written form. Even now, with the background and whatnot of Project Necromancer coming out of Bad Batch, we're not even really getting a lot of that backstory you would expect for leading into the sequel trilogy now that it's done and we kind of know how it played out, being done within pages. It's being done basically with Bad Batch and whatnot, and a little bit within the pages. Where I think they really are kind of shining right now to an extent, though, is the High Republic stuff. And with the High Republic, what we're getting is an entirely new era of exploration in the canon. And in essence, sort of three different eras, kind of, because you have the Phase 1 stuff, then they pulled a Lucas and jumped back for an earlier Phase 2, and then jumping to shortly after Phase 1 to get to Phase 3. I do not find the Nihil, the enemies of that series, particularly compelling. Was it Draugr or whatever the plant enemy was really kind of dull to me. It all feels like, if you want to take a Disney comparison, it's the many instances where there are faceless hordes of many, many monsters coming at you, working for the big bad, and nobody gives a crap as they're all being wiped out by our heroes because they're just the faceless minions. Like Avengers Infinity War in Wakanda kind of stuff. The Nihil are interesting conceptually, but they don't feel like they've really kind of hit that point where they feel like a true menace, except for, I will say, they feel like it in the third wave a little bit more, third phase a little bit more, now that they sort of have their exclusion zone, and we're getting more of the interactions and seeing more into the mindsets of them, with our Senator character and the Eye having conversations about what they, the different visions for where this space goes from here. But by and large, I have found that some of the characters are interesting. There are some compelling dynamics in them, like sort of the big three of the High Republic era, Avar and the others. But at the same time, so Elzar and Stellan, for those who are wondering. But the fact that so much of their focus right now is on the High Republic is going to lead to an issue or a concern that echoes something I said many, many years ago with Legends that we'll tackle after this next piece. And the next piece, of course, is the comics. The comics for Star Wars right now, I feel like are not in... I don't think they're in as good a place as, say, the books, to some degree. In that... they've introduced some really interesting new characters, like Dr. Aphra. Chelli Aphra is a fantastic new character. Probably the single best new character, perhaps, of the entire story group canon. Compelling, interesting, fun to read, fun to see interact with other characters and so forth. But the comics, while they are dabbling a little bit in other places, they really are fixated as hell, after a decade still, fixated on the gap between A New Hope and Return of the Jedi. Thank God they finally got past The Empire Strikes Back, but they're really fixated in that particular era. And while it's interesting to a degree to see where certain things evolve, like where do they find out about the second Death Star now in this continuity? How do they keep the fleet safe and so forth? What are the plans to try to rescue Han, and how do those go awry before Return of the Jedi and so forth? There are interesting bits within there, but they're really dragging this out. 10 years and you're still in that same 4-year stretch, and you really haven't done a whole lot beyond it, except for the High Republic tying into the books as well, and a few little, smatterings of comics elsewhere. And the stories that they're telling in that era, you've got, the mainline Star Wars book, so the main film characters from the original trilogy. You have the Afra series, which typically I think has been probably the best of the series. You have the Darth Vader series, compelling to an extent, but a cast of background characters who really kind of suck at times. And then you have the Bounty Hunters series with a sometimes changing cast that's really made me interested in Valence way more than, say, the original Marvel series did back in the Legends continuity, or pre-Legends and eventually into Legends. But a series that kind of ran its course for, I think, a little too long. So, and in that era, they're following a Marvel mainline strategy, which is every year or two, we need a massive crossover to bring all these characters together into some big thing. And that was one thing that always kind of differentiated Star Wars from things like Marvel comics, from things like the X-Men comics. And that is that Star Wars was a shared universe. You don't need a giant freaking crossover to have characters from one story appear in another. You just got to keep it consistent. That's it. You don't need some bombastic thing. And what has happened is they've been really hit or miss with their giant crossovers. Vader Down was pretty good. What was the other one? It was a Screaming Citadel or something like that. Was the other one? My brain is, like I said, this is all mostly off the cuff here. The next one was okay, but kind of kind of more of a Halloween vibe. The stuff with Crimson Dawn, having it be essentially 3 different, big events kind of string together. Interesting. I don't think it all worked, but I thought it was pretty interesting to see Kira back. It would have been nice to see more of that on screen with like Maul coming in and whatnot, as they sort of hinted at with Solo, that then never happened. But to see that kind of playing out was pretty interesting to see. That was probably the better, I think, of the crossovers that they have tried to do, and a little bit more in depth. But then you also have, for example, like recently with Dark Droids. Dark Droids didn't at any point to me feel Star Wars. It was really kind of lame. Oh no, this sentient droidy thing wants to go out and assimilate, take over everything. First it came for the metal, now it comes for the meat, next it comes for the veggies. That just really didn't work well for me. And on the meantime, you've also got the stuff coming through the comics for, say, the High Republic. And the High Republic's stories, pretty solid, pretty fun. I actually do like the stories being told in comic form for High Republic. I like High Republic generally. I don't think it holds a candle to some of the other big event crossover stuff like, say, New Jedi Order, but still good stuff. Or the Clone Wars era, 2002 to 2005. So that's been pretty good. But you've also got this tendency of these really goofy kiddie stories coming out of IDW and to some degree coming out of Dark Horse, where you're just like, these stories where there's High Republic or otherwise, why do these exist? It's like, what if we took Star Wars Tales before they retooled it for issues 21 through 24 and made it even more inconsequential? Or even more kiddie, I guess. To see Dark Horse go from the kind of storytelling they used to tell when they had the main Star Wars license, stuff like, Republic and Legacy and Rebellion and Knights of the Old Republic, to now doing what they're doing with these goofy little tales is kind of sad, but it's all they're really being allowed to do. Everything else is being told the Marvel way. And as I've said many times with both Marvel and DC, I think Marvel works great on film. I think DC works great on television, usually, not as well on film. And both of them in comic form work best when they're doing something that's not their standard. The ultimate Marvel stuff, the Elseworlds DC stuff. Give me the mainline Marvel and DC stuff, and I think my brain and my taste kind of move beyond that probably after high school, maybe right after college. I don't really care about the mainline stuff and the way the mainline stuff is written. And a lot of the Star Wars stuff right now feels like it's being written more for a Marvel audience than a Star Wars audience to an extent in terms of the stylistic nature of it. There are interesting things here and there. Like I said, Chelly Afra is a breath of fresh air, but by and large, you're not going to have the big events in the comics. And if you do have big consequential events, they're either ones we already know are coming within that stretch between A New Hope and Return of the Jedi, or they're these big crossover events that either work or don't, and you're kind of stuck with them. And that is that other point that I wanted to make about the books and the comics. Right now, if your thing is not retreading the ground between A New Hope and Return of the Jedi ad nauseum, or the High Republic, kind of screwed. Because there's not a whole lot of Star Wars publishing that is there for you outside of those lanes for the most part. There is some, but for the most part. It is very much to me, and I talked about this back in the early days of Chrono Radio, that it's kind of like when you had New Jedi Order and the Clone Wars stuff, the original pre-TCW Clone Wars stuff, 2002 to 2005, running around the same time, in like the end of one, beginning of the other, or just relentlessly dark storytelling. And if that wasn't your cup of tea for Star Wars, you were kind of screwed because those were the main lines they were producing. Little smatterings of other stuff, but that was where their focus was. Right now, if you don't like those things I mentioned, High Republic or the old original trilogy in between films kind of era, there's not a whole lot else to choose from. I would like to see it be more diverse. I'd like to see it break out of the box a little bit more, and do stories that matter. But that means not being as beholden to, oh my gosh, we can't do a story here. Maybe someday, 10, 15 years from now, we might want to make a movie in that spot covering this important thing that we think might be interesting to see happen. So heaven forbid we touch it now. I get it. You're trying to avoid potential future contradictions. But it means playing so safe with what stories you are telling that often they aren't as compelling as they could or should be. So enjoyable, but they can't hold a candle to the Legends era stuff because it was a very different context in which they were being created. And companies with sort of a different vision of it. Dark Horse versus Marvel, for example. But I think we're in an okay place, I guess, with the comics and with the books, because there are some good ones coming out, some really solid ones coming out. If you like the High Republic, you're getting a lot of it, and it's well integrated between the books and the comics in a way that really only the Clone Wars managed to do in the Legends continuity in terms of simultaneous publishing. But if you don't like that stuff, you're kind of stuck. And if you don't like that stuff and you're not a fan of constantly retreading ground or doing these massive crossover events, Marvel style, in the original trilogy era, not sure what there's going to be there for you. That brings us to Star Wars games. Star Wars games. Tabletop games, which is something I'm particularly into at this point, though video games as well. Tabletop games, I feel like we are past a heyday point. I think the heyday of Star Wars games in tabletop sense was in the early days of Fantasy Flight games. X-Wing, Imperial Assault, the Star Wars Living card game, LCG, then getting into maybe a little bit of Armada and so forth. But that has sort of given way, which were well-received games, well-supported games, with, in a couple of cases there, very consumer-friendly models. You want to buy an expansion, one of the big campaign expansions for Imperial Assault, don't worry. If you don't want to buy these little ally packs that come with these extra characters, we'll give you the cards and tokens to use the characters in the big box. You don't have to buy those separate ones unless you just want the minis and maybe some extra side missions or something. It's okay. Or extra skirmish maps and whatnot. It's okay. Living card game. Every product you buy, you know exactly what cards are in it. There is no randomness, no blind buys at all. It's an LCG model. Fantastic, very consumer-friendly for its time. But then Fantasy Flight got picked up by Asmodee, eventually picked up by Embracer Group. Now they're being spun off, and Asmodee is going to become like some debt monster out there on, to help Embracer's debt. You have a lot of the stuff that was being done under Fantasy. I didn't even mention the RPGs, that great new RPG system that they launched with Edge of the Empire that continued on in Age of Rebellion and Force and Destiny. not Forces of Destiny, Force and Destiny, the RPG, a great new RPG engine that they developed there. And now the miniatures games are off to kind of one company, Atomic Mass. And no more Imperial Assault. Now we need just basic like Warhammer type games. We need like Legion. We need Shatterpoint, not as well received typically as Legion. We need to revamp the rules for X-Wing over and over again. But keep it in print. LCG, no, we don't need an LCG anymore. Screw an LCG. You know what we need? On the one hand, it's a deck building game, which is awesome. I love the Star Wars deck building game. It's all in one box, kind of LCG style. And they have another board game that's fantastic, Star Wars Outer Rim. But what are we going to replace the LCG with as our big moneymaker of Star Wars cards? Well, first it was Destiny with random packs with dice and cards. And now it's Star Wars Unlimited. A Star Wars CCG TCG again. Blind booster packs return. Great money-making model, shitty consumer friendliness model. But that is back. The RPGs are now under a different studio for reprinting, but we're not really getting much in the way of any new stuff. It's kind of like the corporatization of Fantasy Flight upwards has in a lot of ways driven down the level of Star Wars tabletop games. Though I will say it's nice to see other companies that are Disney licensees being able to dive into it. You have Dark Side Rising, which I really enjoy, which is not available in the US. You got to import it, which is like Thanos Rising and stuff like that. You have the new Mandalorian game that is coming. It's Mandalorian Adventure game that's coming out. And you have a Star Wars version of Disney Villainous, which is kind of a fun asymmetric battling type of game. But we definitely are past a heyday of Star Wars tabletop games, which really was early Fantasy Flight. So where do I feel Star Wars tabletop/board games are right now? We're not in a great place. There are smatterings of brilliance, but by and large, we're back to sort of the corporate malaise, I think, with it. Video game-wise, you know, we've had heydays before, like a lot of different games coming around the prequel era and whatnot, all kinds of different systems. Now, we've kind of gotten out of the EA-driven loot box bullshit, which is nice. And the nobody wants a single-player campaign thing, where everything was, it's got to be multiplayer. Like, say, the way that Battlefront 1 was, and the Battlefront 2, they actually gave us a campaign, but still was very focused on the multiplayer, and the microtransactions, and the loot boxes, and all that kind of stuff. And it seems like we're in a pretty decent era for Star Wars games, but I would say that I'd say that kind of with some trepidation. We got Jedi Fallen Order, which was great. Jedi Survivor, which was also great. We have Star Wars Outlaws coming. It's Ubisoft. It's open world. Will it fall into the Ubisoft open world traps of collectathon and a lot of stuff that's meaningless and repetitive? Or will it really work? I'm hoping it will really work. We've had some other oddballs over a while. As anyone who watches this channel probably knows, I'm a huge fan of VR gaming. It changed my perspective on gaming in general. It was a mind-blowing thing when I first tried it. Very hard to convince people to play VR because if you show them a 2D image of some VR stuff, it just doesn't look right because it's not stereoscopic 3D and you're not seeing it all around you. You're seeing it on a screen. But Star Wars has dipped into VR even. We had a Battlefront mission at one point, a little Rogue One tied-in mission. But, you know, we had the Vader Immortal series on Quest and eventually on PSVR and whatnot. We had Tales from the Galaxy's Edge. And we had all of Star Wars Squadrons, the flying game on PlayStation 4, being able to be played completely in VR. It's really cool to see Star Wars stuff being able to be done in VR, but I don't think anything has really nailed it yet. Squadrons was cool because you were in the cockpit being able to look around, but because of the shapes of the cockpit, it really didn't have that fun, immersive craziness of something like Eve of Valkyrie. Instead, you were kind of looking over stuff to see stuff. The Rebel ships were a little easier to see out of, but if you're in a TIE fighter, it's basically just a bunch of electronics on a window. Might as well be playing 2D for the most part. On the other hand, you know, it was cool, though, that they took a game and made it fully playable in VR. A full-fledged game. Very much akin to what, say, Capcom has done by making fully-fledged VR modes that are absolutely incredible for Resident Evil 4 Remake and for Resident Evil Village. Less so for Resident Evil Biohazard, Resident Evil 7, but that was on the previous generation of hardware. You had Vader Immortal that told a solid story, but was very linear, but you did get to use a lightsaber and stuff, which was pretty cool, but very short. And then a more open world, go around and explore and enjoy the story kind of stuff with Tales from the Galaxy's Edge, but that really comes off more as like an advertisement for Galaxy's Edge at Disney, because they were really pushing it around that time. The gunplay is not great relative to most VR gunplay games, and it felt a little directionless to some degree, but still cool to see that expanding outward. But I'd love to see them push it forward more. If Ubisoft, since it seems like that's a gunplay kind of game, takes Outlaws and gives us a fully fledged way of playing the entire thing in VR, I would love them for it. But I don't see that happening. It seems like really the only big company right now that is willing to take their AAA high-end, already awesome 2D games and give them a VR fully playable version is Capcom. But boy, if you play Resident Evil 4 Remake or Resident Evil Village and then play the VR modes for them, you will see how great something like a fully fledged Star Wars AAA game being given the VR treatment could be. I want it. I don't think it's going to happen. But you know, time will tell, I suppose. So video game wise, I think we're on an upswing. I think we went on a pretty big downswing. Now we're on an upswing. But are we going to continue going up, or is it going to start middling out now that we see, for instance, Ubisoft being able to develop a Star Wars game, not just under EA and all that kind of stuff that we've seen before? We shall see. Let's see. Then that brings us to, I think that just leaves Star Wars theme parks and then fandom, I suppose. Star Wars theme parks, obviously we're in a better place, right? Star Tours is replaced with the newer version of Star Tours, which I'm told is very cool and immersive. I remember the original Star Tours. I've never tried the new one. And of course, we have an entire theme park, right, with Galaxy's Edge. So, of course, we're in a better place with that. That is a given. Fandom-wise. Fandom-wise, I think we are still in a pretty bad place. And we've been in a bad place for a while. But I don't think we're in a bad place necessarily as much now because of the actual event 10 years ago in the reboot, as it's more of a societal around us kind of thing, a context kind of thing. 10 years ago, when the reboot happened, a lot of the animosity that was going back and forth in different fandom groups and the way there was a split within fandom was because of the reboot. It was the anti-Disney versus pro-Disney, or in my case, the enjoy Star Wars in general versus the no, you must enjoy it my way or you're evil cadre. And I think now it's more just this general intolerance for anything not of one's own personal preference. And I don't think that is a Star Wars thing. I think it's a societal thing. It is fed by social media. It is fed by echo chambers and siloing ourselves in different groups. It is fed by just the general nature of the society, the media landscape, the political landscape and such around us, that seems to reward that behavior and often punish intellectual honesty and trying to be more about reconciliation and logic and being a voice of reason than getting into a silo and scoring points and likes by being a shit to somebody. I don't think that is a fandom-specific thing at all. I think that's more of a societal thing right now. But fandom has fallen into it head first, and the media machine keeps churning that. I do think that from a fandom standpoint, I think podcasting, which I was a big part of for a long time, is in a better place, just in the sense that we went from being a small community, though it was a great community, to being more broad now, where you can find podcasts on almost any niche in Star Wars you would love to see. That is cool. I think Star Wars fan films, when they are being made, are of much higher quality because the technology has advanced so much to allow that at home. I think fandom gatherings, I've only ever been to one celebration, so I can't really compare celebrations. I do feel as though, from what I get from others, that Star Wars celebrations feel more corporatized now, but they are bigger and have a lot of cool events than some of the early small celebrations, but someone could correct me on that. Like I said, I've only been to the one, not really fully in context with the celebrations other than watching documentaries about them. But yeah, I think fandom had a rift already, And that rift was exacerbated by the societal context, and the societal context has kept the rift and other rifts alive. So just like anywhere else in society right now, it seems as though fandom is divided. I don't want to say irrevocably so, but maybe. It really kind of depends. Not necessarily over the Disney thing, but just in general, in all kinds of teeny tiny little camps. If what we saw in the past with different groups of fandom when the internet allowed groups to connect was a bunch of small rebel cells out there combining into a rebel alliance, what we're seeing now is a dissolution and an opposite approach to that, where the alliance has shattered and now it's all these different cells out there, and some cells are great, some cells are out there doing good, some cells ain't. Some cells are little cesspools that you really want to avoid. I've been lucky by being part of the Star Wars home video community. It's a pretty positive community. We have outliers here and there from time to time. It's been a pretty positive community, but I don't spend a lot of time, if any, in other Star Wars groups. On Facebook, it's basically just the home video group and just with buddies talking on there. On YouTube, I'll watch stuff, but I generally won't comment on other people's stuff very often. It's very rare. I actually commented on a video for the first time in ages, I think last night, when one of my favorite board game streamers actually streamed one of my favorite games with an expansion that almost nobody has streamed. That was Meet Me at the Table doing a Return to Dark Tower with the Covenant expansion. But I don't just travel in those areas because, like I said before, if fandom is making you stressed, if your hobby is making you stressed, you're doing it wrong. It's supposed to be enjoyment. It's supposed to be something to lift the stress, not add the stress. And a lot of those groups out there seem to thrive on creating stress amongst their own members. It's kind of a bad scene, so to speak. So I've been lucky to be able to stay out of it mostly. When I see people popping up, like on this anniversary, trying to be uncivil here on the channel, thankfully, I have a button I can press to keep that from becoming something that other people have to deal with and try to keep the conversation civil and productive within the comments. But, you know, I think that is unfortunately, just because of what I'm focused on now with the home video collecting and whatnot, and the way that I manage what I do online and what I spend my time with, I'm one of the lucky ones to not constantly be being dragged down into the muck and dealing with that kind of negativity and that sort of a poisonous fandom atmosphere out there. I would hope that hopefully you watching this have found places like that, that is safe places, safe harbors for that, where you can keep hope alive, so to speak, to use an overused Star Wars word, where you can have that fandom and fellowship and enjoyment together without it becoming something that is toxic. And for those of you who are in communities that are particularly toxic and are finding it stressing yourself, consider finding somewhere else or making your own smaller community. Maybe you won't have as many people around you to engage with. But if the engagements were negative in the first place, who gives a damn if it's less, right? It's quality, not quantity, when it comes to the engagements that you have with other fans, at least in my opinion. And of course, as Dennis Miller once said, of course, that's just my opinion. I could be wrong. I think he said it more than once. So big picture, I think Star Wars is in an okay place, but it kind of depends on where you are. When it comes to the films, we have none right now. I'm hoping some of the ones they're talking about come to fruition. It was great to see more new Star Wars films. Your mileage will vary on them. I have, of course, my favorites and least favorites of that batch. Star Wars television, great to see we're having a live-action series and some new animated series. But again, if you're not big into the Filoniverse side of Star Wars, you might find that lacking. But there are some that are not as heavily into Filoniverse-esque stuff, though even Obi-Wan had the Inquisitors. Books, be great if they could do more momentous stuff, but they won't. And mileage will vary on various ones. There's been some great ones and some meh stuff out there. Comics, I wish they would get beyond the original trilogy era and start exploring more other than just in the High Republic. And of course, if you don't like both of those eras, you're not going to really like what's going on right now. Thank goodness for Chelly Afra, and Marvel, please stop with the crossovers unless they're meaningful and don't suck. And with the kiddie stuff from IDW and Dark Horse right now, I guess it has its place, but not my cup of tea. Cup of calf, so to speak. Video games and tabletop games. Video games on an upswing. I'd like to see it upswing more. I'd like to see more VR, but I don't know if it's going to happen. Tabletop games, we hit the heyday, we're on a decline at this point into more consumer unfriendly type stuff, unfortunately. But that is a corporatization side effect, I believe, at least with Fantasy Flight Games on up. Though again, unfinished business as the expansion to Outer Rim and the original Outer Rim are still just great, fairly recent releases. Theme parks going gangbusters at this point, and Fandom, God help us, or Force help us, or maybe, I don't know, the Mortis gods help us, because technically they're in both continuities or something. I don't know. But speaking to someone who is mid-40s now, I still enjoy Star Wars. I'm still willing to partake in Star Wars of different stripes. Yeah, I wish Legends had been able to continue alongside the new canon, but I'm glad they didn't shatter Legends to get to the new canon. So maybe the decision made 10 years ago, while not great for Legends fans, was better than the alternative could have been. It's funny, what popped into my head just now was a quote from Joe Biden that he says a lot, right? Don't compare me to the Almighty, compare me to the alternative. Don't compare where Legends is now to if it had continued, because with the buyout from Disney, that wasn't going to happen. At least not in the way that we knew it. Compare it to the alternative, which was if they had just started making stuff in the Clone Wars type vein, like with T-Canon, and shattered the crap out of a bunch of parts of it, and Legends wasn't even left whole at all. But anyway, I digress. Like I said, this is more flow of thought than anything else, but I did want to make sure to hit television, movies, books, comics, tabletop and video games, theme parks, and fandom. And I think at this point, I have done that. So, for those who consider me a traitor because I'm willing to enjoy the current canon and be a big fan of Legends, even to this day, I would hope that this helps clarify my thoughts. It's not treacherous to enjoy both. And if you really got down to it, my preferred continuity is the one that those folks, those purists, prefer. I just don't take a hardline stance because I'm willing to be intellectually honest about where things stood and where things stand, and the fact that I just enjoy Star Wars. Give me Star Wars that's good, I'll be a happy guy. With that, we'll wrap up this rather long vlog. Thank you for watching, and may the Force be with the home video viewers, the Star Wars readers, the movie viewers, the TV viewers. You know what? May the Force be with anyone who is a Star Wars fan who is not trying to dictate what that means for someone else.